Today we tear down a complete transmission right here on Shop Tour Reviews. I'm Tim, see you in a moment. What we have here is an NV4500 transmission. Now, any of you 4x4 guys probably know exactly what I'm talking about. They're typically behind a Cummins, or in GM's case, a lot of the late 90s and early 2000 model trucks, you could get these with this NV4500 5-speed transmission. And this is out of our 3/4 ton Chevrolet. Now, I had an issue, so we thought, you know what, why not tear this thing down, rebuild it right here on the channel. Today's video is just gonna be on the teardown. We'll get our parts and we'll do a rebuild as well. So we'll have that in a second video that'll be coming up probably in about a week from now. So let's get to it. And for this teardown and rebuild, there's a couple of tools that you're really gonna wanna have. Number one is the actual spline socket to actually take off the spline nut or the spanner nut or whatever you wanna call that. This is a specialty socket that we actually made. You can buy them, but we actually made this one. You'll see that in the video. And then the other thing is, a lot of times I'm trying to save you money, like on power tools, things like that. This is a situation where we couldn't find our correct snap ring pliers to actually spread the snap rings out. And there's a couple of heavy duty ones on there. So we bought this cheapy set, did not work well. So this is where you want to invest a little bit of money in a good hand tool that's going to do the job for you. Back to the video. So this is the GM NV4500, which is pretty much identical to the Chrysler NV4500 or the MOPAR, other than the shaft splines as well as a couple of internals here in the 5th gear on the backside. But as far as the majority of this case and build, it's pretty much identical. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is we have already started on this. We kind of dug into it before we realized we wanted to film. But anyway, I promise you nothing's been done that was tough. Basically the top plate here, all 13mm bolts. So pull out those 13mm bolts and then this slides up. You may have to pry it, but it does have nice areas right here on each corner where you can take you a pry bar and pry that up. And most everything on here had just like a rubber RTV or gray RTV, gray silicone. So pry that up, they'll slide out. These shifting forks will slide out. Be careful, these do have pads on it on this one right here. These do not. So you can pull that straight out and lay that aside. So that's really all that's done there. Here you've got 5/16 inch Allen or hex keys here. And what I've found works really well is a couple of 6-inch extensions. And if you have a wobble extension, that works really well because a couple of these are not exactly straight on. And I use just a little 3/8 impact and I could easily zip these out. But that wobble extension gives me just a little bit of wiggle room for like right up here where you can't get straight onto it. But that, you know, little bit of a wobble gets me offset where I can zip these out. None of these were overly tight, so they were pretty easy to get out. I will say you will have to do a little bit of prying on this. It seemed to be glued pretty well. What seemed to be the ticket for us is kind of trimmed all the excess away. And then once we got all the excess away, we knocked it with a little plastic hammer a few times. And then it was able to break that free. And so that's just going to come straight off. And by the way, you might notice a little bit of carnage like we have right there. We can see there's obviously some problems in this transmission. So going to lay that aside. By the way, I like to put down a little cardboard, just a great catch-all, whether you're working on a wood top like this or you got a stainless top. Unless you've got a transmission top, that funnels everything to one side, it's just nice to be able to, absorb some of that oil like we see right here, even though you've probably drained it. So we're going to come back to the back side of that transmission in a second. As on the tail section, this is the front shaft basically. This is your input. This is where your pilot bearing rides. These are just 13mm bolts, so zip those out. Again, just used a quick impact to run these out. This also had RTV behind it. Move those out of the way. And then this is another one where, you may have a small scraper or a little putty knife, what have you. where you can kind of get in there and try not to cause any damage. The case itself is cast iron. The tail section is aluminum housing, and then this right here is aluminum as well. So you don't want to be prying too hard against that. But once you kind of get that broke free, this should just kind of come right out, and you can actually pull out that input shaft as well. And there's your input shaft bearing. So you can see that there. And so you can just lay that aside as well. Now, nothing else can be done here until we get the tail shaft taken apart. Then we can take out this whole section here. You do have this seal here, and it does kind of sit in an indentation, but I took literally this little screwdriver right here, and by hand, didn't have to use a hammer or anything, just kind of got under the lip and started working that out. And then I just got to where I could really, you know, get a lip under it, and then grab a little bit bigger screwdriver, and I was able to kind of work that out without having to hit that with a hammer or drive anything in it whatsoever. By the way, you see some nice needle bearing carnage right there. By the way, our main shaft, which is down here, is what's locked up on this. We don't know yet what from, but anyway, so you'll pull that out, and that'll be part of your rebuild kit when you order that. So now you're pretty much done with this side for right now. You can take these inspection plates off if you want to. By the way, most everything in this so far has been SAE. You know, I used a 13 millimeter for the 1/2 inch bolts, but then I noticed here, these are not 15s, these are actually 9/16. And so you can take those off. And this is basically kind of two things. Number one is an inspection plate, but also I believe this is where you can connect a PTO as well. So again, some more carnage here. That's a magnet, and got some metal up there. So we'll lay that aside. Then we can flip this around, and we can take this inspection plate off as well. We might as well, if we're going to clean this thing up. By the way, on that other inspection plate I took off, this thing here is not reinforcement. It's actually got your tag with your exact model number transmission. I believe serial number as well. So if you're ordering anything, that's going to tell you right there exactly what's in that. Okay, that's just your fill hole, so you can pull that out if you want to. By the way, this also tells you exactly what fluid to be running. Critical issue with these transmissions, to make sure that you run the fluid that they call for. These synchronizers are made out of special material. If you're not running that synthetic fluid that they recommend, that they will come apart, and it's not a matter of if, rather than when. Now, here's where we're at. So we've got the front input shaft out. We've got the front pretty much taken apart where we can. So back here on this shift fork for 5th gear, so you will need to get a punch, and I think this is a 4 millimeter punch here, and drive those pins out. They come out really easy, so just get you the right size punch, drive those out, and just 2 little roll pins will come out of here. And this will slide off of this dowel as soon as we get this off. Now, this is one thing that differs for the GM and Chrysler, or at least on the Chrysler or MOPARs. I have not seen this, what looks like a harmonic balancer, be on those Chryslers or on the Dodges. But on the Chevrolet, as you see here, we do have it. So the hard thing is the retaining nut for both this balancer as well as the main gear, the main 5th gear up here, is retained by this spanner nut that's in here. Now, this spanner nut has 4 indentions in it, and it has to basically have a socket or a wrench that hooks up to those 4 indentions. It's not a common size, and it's something that's usually a specialty tool. Now, here's what we're doing. I went down to the local auto parts store and looked for spanner wrenches. Well, there's axle spindle nuts that look like a spanner and require these specific sockets, and they have them in different sizes. This is the 2 3/8. I believe the exact model number is on here somewhere. I'll make sure I put that in the description. However, it was a little too small, so I took my die grinder with a carbide tip and I just ground out. I'm telling you, I did not have to grind out a lot. However, it wasn't long enough to slide all the way on the shaft and also hit the nut. So I took my cutoff tool and I cut it off. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this and I'm going to take a socket. So go to your nearest Harbor Freight, and buy you a socket about the same size, or a piece of pipe. You could take a piece of pipe, put it in the middle here, lengthen that up, weld it up, and you'll be good to go. So you do need a welder. But anyway, I'm just going to take this socket, I'm going to weld it onto there, and we're going to have a deep socket that now we can get that retaining nut off. So now what I have here is I have a socket. Didn't know Sonic made a 2 3/8 inch spanner. Anyway, so now I've got my spanner socket. I've got a 1 inch impact, so that's why I put that adapter on here. Let me take that off actually. So now I'm going to, and it fits rather snug, which is good. Going to make sure that's on there really well. My adapter on. Put some heat on it. These fifth gear retaining nuts are known for failure, to back off and let fifth gear basically drive into the housing and cause damage. So a lot of times these things get a lot of Loctite put on them. So I'm going to heat it up. 210. I'm going to heat it up a little more. So red Loctite is removable, I think, when you heat to 500 degrees. So I've got a ways to go here. Let's try this one more time. Last try here, I had to do some welding. Let's see if, here. Look at there. That thing's probably red hot. So, it had been messed with before, or I don't think I would have had a problem. I think my socket would have worked well. But you can see it was kind of eaten up. I don't know if you can see now, but maybe after it cools off, I'll show it again. But it had already been eaten up. Most of the time, you're going to put a new nut on here anyway. So, you know, I thought, you know what, why not? And I kind of welded up where it had basically slipped off. I tried chiseling on it a little bit. That didn't help. But I really think heating it up, it probably had Loctite on it. So I think heating it up did the trick, and then really hammering that socket on there. But I will show you there's my socket. The socket held up really well. It really did. Even though the cutting I did on it really doesn't show a lot. You can see the teeth wore in a little bit, I think, where it was hitting those welds that I put in there. Other than that, the socket did really well. Now, this really wasn't on very tight at all. I literally just put this on, and I didn't hit it with impact or anything, just started turning it by hand, and it is sliding off. So that's a good thing. Okay, so before we pull fifth gear off here, we've already got our pins driven out of this fork here. So we should be able to slide that off, pull this synchro off. Yeah, we've got a snap ring. The opening is right there. We'll pull that snap ring off, and then this should slide off as well. But let's get fifth gear off. So before we mess with pulling fifth gear off, I just wanted to show you this mound of, that looks to be red Loctite there. Yeah, that's red Loctite. So that's, when we finally heated that up, we finally broke that free. So these threads were loaded up with red Loctite holding that nut on, which they should be. But again, that's what you're dealing with. You're not just dealing with a fine threaded nut that has been impacted on, but you're also dealing with red Loctite, which again withstands up to like 500 degrees. I think blue Loctite lets go like 250, 260, but red will hold on till 500 degrees. Okay, I was gonna build something special for a puller to pull this, and it literally, I tapped it with a hammer and it slid right off. So I literally just gave this a couple of taps. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd recommend using a puller, but ours was not on there very tight, so it just meshes with those splines, and it slid right off of there. We're going to go ahead and run these 13mm bolts out of this plate here. Okay, so this bearing needs to come off. I don't have my bearing splitter with me, so I'm going to use a puller. It's probably just going to pull this bearing in two. I know I'm replacing this bearing. I just want it out of the way. By the way, using an Allen head in this to keep the threads from galling. That should give us enough clearance now to remove that out of the case. And now there's a little bit of the carnage down there. So quite a few needle bearings there. We'll clean that out here in a moment. So now we pretty much have an empty case other than this fork here and that race there, which looks like it's ready to come out. Yeah, I'm not going to be reusing that at all. Okay, so this case is now cleaned out other than this shift fork here, which we're going to leave that in there. This thing's ready to be degreased, cleaned up, and get ready for assembly. Make sure there's no cracks, things like that. That's where the original bearing locked up right there and locked up the shaft, and therefore I think took out the rest of it, or who knows what happened first, but that one definitely locked up and came apart. Okay, so here we are. I have the main shaft sitting in a piece of wood through a hole so the shaft can stick out the bottom, so we can disassemble that. And I have all the other stuff over there, as you can see. So there's the input shaft, fifth gear, reverse gear, more fifth gear, the harmonic balance or whatever that is, the cluster gear. Everything else is over there, but let's take a look here at the main shaft and get to disassembling this. Okay, so forgot to turn the camera on for a minute. Basically, to take this off, I did have to heat this off. First thing, these springs tuck in here and hold these out. These have a tapered cut on them, so they'll sit in here and won't push out, and those springs go in there. Pretty easy to figure that out, so make sure you get those out before those springs jump everywhere. And then this is actually pressed on. Now, what I did was I took a puller and I hooked my puller on it and didn't really want to pull, so I heated this up to about 300 degrees. I just got it nice and warm with just a propane torch, not even oxygen acetylene, and got that at about 300 degrees, and then put my puller on there, and it was able to pull that off, and it pulled off of there. And so now, spoke too soon. There we go. So now this comes off, and we'll lay this aside. And then we see some more carnage in here. So we get more needle bearings that are shot. So synchro. Now this one has the actual synchro and synchro cone built into the gear, and I just took my my rubber hammer and or my soft blow hammer and hit around the bottom side of it because more carnage from a needle bearing letting go. And I'm assuming all this black crud is probably the plastic cage of that needle bearing. That over there will add to our carnage pile. And now we have another snap ring right here. And I'll show you this snap ring here in a moment. You can see there on the end, right there on the end, it's tapered almost very sharp. I'm sure from all the needle bearings wearing out in there. Flip it over. Well, that's good. Our bearing came off without having to put a puller on it. Pull this off. And there's the bearing. How to use it, but decent orange. And then spacer. And there's a nice heavy duty snap ring. This one is maybe a pain. Maybe not. Okay, just short of a miracle, I finally got this thing spread. It's just a pain. You're gonna have to work that one for sure. Get there. Pretty good. I don't miss it. Make sure you keep all those dogs. You see that one of these goes in from the bottom and one from the top. So you get 3 springs, 3 of these, as well as you have 4 of these. Okay, so we flipped it back over again, and where I was thinking that dowel pin was, that's just a thrust washer that's on here. So get that off. Pull that little dowel pin out. Save that. And then, there we go. And so there's your main shaft. Well, we found plenty of carnage in the transmission where this thing actually came apart in several places. Looks like this thing may have been run dry. Not sure, but anyway, we're going to rebuild this thing. So we'll get all our parts together, we'll put it back together again, and hopefully it'll run once again. But anyway, there's a teardown. Let us know what you think about it. Also keep track of us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you don't mind, would you hit that like and subscribe button, but only if you like this video. If you didn't like this video, by all means, give us that thumbs down, but would you let us know in the comments why? Have a great day and keep smiling.